Okay, we're going to get started. I'm Jack Trumpor. I'm the Research Director for the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School. I work also with the Harvard Trade Union Program. Class of 2025, we're in the house. And welcome to everyone. I have had the fine honor of often introducing the Green Lecture. People should know that this is actually the Green Memorial Forum. The Harvard Trade Union Program is one of the places where Jim taught for almost 30 years, so we like to honor him. But people should know Jim played an instrumental role in starting the Labor Resource Center at University of Massachusetts, Boston. You had a tour from UMass Boston when you first got here. And Jim was very strong as a public historian to show people in Massachusetts their history and demonstrate many of the things. But I want people to know UMass Boston also has a Jim Green Lecture. Ours is the Forum, and they also have an annual tour of Boston labor sites to honor Jim. So we have a bunch of things, but he made so many important contributions to history, and we're really glad that we have this as a regular part of our programming. So this year, we have Jacqueline Jones, who's Professor Emeritus from the University of Texas, Austin, and I think, there we have some fans.
Easy day.
Jacqueline Jones has produced a tremendous amount of important works, including works that are in the field of labor history. And I think this is the first time we've ever had you to the Harvard Trade Union Program. So, we're really pleased to have you. But one of the reasons we brought her here is that her new book on Boston history, No Right to an Honest Living, the Struggle of Boston's Black Workers in the Civil War Era, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and the paperback just came out this month. So you're some of the first people to have the paperback edition of it. And we're really pleased to hear so much of the success of the book. But I want to stress, sometimes people say to us, to the historians among us, that, well, you're going back to the Civil War, and why are we talking about these kinds of issues? Boston, we had this study in 2015 that the Fed did, and it had shown that the median, that's very important, not to say the average, the median white family had $247,000 of wealth. The median African-American family had $8 of wealth, net worth, after everything was done. And what I think Jacqueline Jones has done is shown the origins of some of these inequalities, why they came about, and were very deep-seated. And sometimes our history gets distorted because when you're in Harvard Square, you see the beautiful statue of Charles Sumner and the great fight against abolitionism. And I think what your book has done a lot of times is that the African-American leaders of the time would often point out that they appreciated some of the great struggles that the abolitionists put up, but they said you focus all the time about the terrible things that Southerners and Southern whites have done, but you don't really look at all the discrimination that's going on in your immediate yard, right, in your neighborhoods around Boston. And it often got very easy to deflect from that because you could just point out some of the great things that Boston had done, and Crispus Attucks had died in the early part of the revolutionary struggle. There are a lot of things that Boston could crow about, but the reality is we had a lot of tremendously deep-seated inequalities, and your book is such an important one to try to uncover the roots of that and get to that so that we today can do a better job of understanding where we've been. I saw that the Urban Institute did an updated study of inequality, and it was still 219,000 for whites and 11,000 for African Americans, a slight improvement, but believe me, this is a very sad thing. And again, I apologize for using the word average because this is an important thing for people to understand. When you see an average wealth statistic, in this country, the median net worth of families is $192,000 from the last major survey. The average wealth is $1,163,000 because the people at the top have accumulated so much tremendous wealth that if you use an average, it looks like we're a much wealthier country than we are. Well, we are wealthy, but a tiny fringe of people have so much of it. And that's something that we need to understand. So I was sorry for being a typical academic and stressing the median, but it's a tremendous difference to know that. And I think if we're going to change things, we got to know this history. And Jacqueline Jones has done so much of this work from very early time to uncover these stories and this history and this background. And thank you so much. And you're also going to say a few words about Jim Green, so I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
That's electrician work.
Anybody union here?
Did you call out the carpenters? Don't worry about it.
It was incidental.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jack, for that nice introduction. And I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be here tonight to deliver the James Green Memorial Lecture. Professor Green's work was tremendously influential to me and my fellow history graduate students at the University of Wisconsin in the early 1970s. His approach to the new labor history encouraged us to think about labor in an expansive way and to prioritize the struggles of working men and women as central to the narrative of American history. Among the topics my friends and I worked on at that point, one of my friends did a dissertation on the Lawrence, Massachusetts textile strike of 1912, another on Irish immigrant workers in Chicago in the late 19th century, another on Mexican-American workers in the American-owned oil fields of Tampico, Mexico in the early 20th century. And in 1980, I began work on a history of Black working women from slavery to the present. And since then, I have focused on workers, both waged and unwaged, throughout American history. Professor Green memorialized the lives of workers through oral histories conducted via the Massachusetts History Workshop and documentary films that reached a wide audience. He was concerned with ordinary workers, including coal miners of West Virginia, the timber workers of Louisiana, the sharecroppers and tenant farmers of Texas, and the packing house workers of Boston, among others. And it was his outreach to a larger audience, as well as his excellent scholarship, that really proved inspirational to us. We mourn his untimely passing in 2016 at the age of 71, but he left an indelible impression on those historians who aspired to his scholarly rigor, his capacious view of labor, and his commitment to social justice for all. And I would like to acknowledge that Professor Green's widow, Janet, is here with us tonight, and his son, Nick, and we welcome them. So I thought I would start with the title of the book. And it comes from a talk given by John S. Rock in 1860 in Boston. John S. Rock was born in 1825 in New Jersey. He became a dentist and then a physician. He was a public lecturer, and he ended his career as an attorney and was the first Black person admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court bar. So he gave this talk in March of 1860, and it was the 90th anniversary of the death of Crispus Attucks, who was a man of color and really the first martyr in the American Revolution. He was killed in the Boston Massacre of March 1770. So usually at this event, it was an annual event sponsored by the African American community in Boston. Usually there were great testimonials to Crispus Attucks, to the liberty of all and so forth, very uplifting. But John Rock took the podium and he said, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not going to talk about Crispus Attucks. I'm going to talk about our so-called friends here in Boston, the white anti-slavery activists. And this was quite shocking at the time because these white allies, William Lloyd Garrison, Theodore Parker, Wendell Phillips, were known for their courage, their eloquence. But as John S. Rock pointed out, they were not so concerned about the welfare of their neighbors in Boston. So there's been a lot written about African Americans in New England during this period. The fight for Black legal rights, especially suffrage, and so forth. And I will say that in 1860, Massachusetts seemed to be a beacon of equality in terms of civil rights. Men could vote according to the Constitution of 1780. By 1860, the schools were integrated, intermarriage was legal, Black men were beginning to serve on juries, and these things made the Commonwealth stand out in New England and the nation, and there was a great deal of self-congratulation on the part of Massachusetts whites during this period. Well, anyway, this historiography, what historians have written, it's really very powerful, but I noticed that in this literature, there was little or nothing about Black people's struggle to make a living. And I don't need to tell this crowd that work is a central, everyday lived experience. It was during this period a major focus of Black political struggle. Patterns of labor had significant implications for family life and wealth accumulation. And work was a preoccupation of 19th century reformers, from abolitionists in the antebellum period to labor activists and academics in the progressive era. So I have three major themes this evening, and along the way I'd like to introduce you to some really interesting people from history, people of color from Boston's history. So the three themes are: first, Black workers remained confined mainly to menial labor despite three major upheavals in the 19th century: the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, and the emergence of the commercial retail sector in the late 19th century. And by major upheavals, just keep in mind that the Civil War claimed 700,000 lives. Equivalent today, that would be as if this country lost 7.5 million men and women in some kind of war. Over their lifetimes, most Black laborers contended with irregular, low-paying jobs because a whole host of potential white allies refused to press for just working conditions and opportunities in private homes, businesses, city public works projects, and the U.S. military. And the third theme is that nevertheless, Black men and women showed a great deal of resilience, creativity, and resourcefulness in making a living and sustaining their families, at times in ways that were not documented in the census or other formal or official reports dealing with the social division of labor. So the book has a narrative thread based on the arrival in September of 1847 of 66 newly freed enslaved workers from Virginia. They were the slaves of Carter Edlow. He died in 1844 and stipulated in his will that his labors should be set free upon his death. It took 3 years of litigation to make this come true, and in September of 1847, 66 of those workers chose to come to Boston. And I highlight Peter Randolph here. He was their de facto leader. He was called Blacksmith Peter because as an enslaved man, he was a skilled blacksmith. He could not find that kind of work when he came to Boston. He was barred from skilled work. He became what is called a tender, which is basically a janitor or messenger. And later he was ordained a minister in the Baptist church. So he and the other passengers on that ship in 1847 form the thread of my narrative because I follow these folks through the 19th century. And when this group arrived in Boston in 1847, they were met at the dock by Samuel May, who was an assistant to William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist. And just to give you a sense here, Samuel May, a white minister, arguing here that here's a great experiment. These 66 of Carter Edlow's enslaved workers, they're not fugitives. They haven't had to bribe their way, sneak their way north. They came on board a ship as free people. So we're going to see if they can take care of themselves. This is a great experiment. And this will give you an idea of the skepticism and, in fact, cynicism of even the white abolitionists at this time. And just a reminder that Boston was a port city, and it was a city full of immigrants during this period, especially immigrants from Ireland. Now, most Black women during this period worked as laundresses or as domestic servants, the men as peddlers or hawkers, porters, tenders, servants. And most had piecemeal, not long-standing jobs, and they had to look every day, many of the men, for a bit of work. And that's why I include the street scene, because most Black men were what we call casual laborers. They went around from place to place, seeing if a shopkeeper needed some work that day, if they could wash windows or sweep floors, so forth and so on. And we know about this routine partly because of testimony provided at the rendition hearing for this man. Anthony Burns escaped from Richmond, Virginia in 1854. He came on board a ship to Boston, and as soon as he got to the city, he started to look for work. And the rendition hearing, which eventually would result in his being sent back to his owner in Richmond, the rendition hearing focused on his odyssey in the Boston streets looking for work those days after he arrived. He went to a dancing master studio, a hotel owner, a clothing store owner, looking for a few hours of work. So I mentioned these potential allies, and I want to go over why we might have thought that they would have a concern for justice for Black workers in the workplace. And famous abolitionist, activist, Frederick Douglass here. Again, like John Rock, taking white abolitionists to task. And it is true that these men like Garrison, Theodore Parker, Wendell Phillips were extremely courageous. I mean, a mob dragged William Lloyd Garrison through the streets. These men were eloquent. Boston was a very conservative city. Abolitionists were a distinct minority in the city, and they were not a popular group. But as Rock and Douglass pointed out, these white abolitionists cared more about enslaved workers in the South than they did about their black neighbors in Boston. So white employers were reluctant to hire blacks because it might offend their white workers. And whites of all stations regularly patronized places that prevented blacks from working there. So again, we might have expected some kind of allyship from white abolitionists here, but that was not the case. And in fact, William Lloyd Garrison and others feared that any attention to Boston's blacks would maybe drain money away from the abolitionist cause focused on destroying slavery in the South. A second group that I consider are the Republicans. The Republican Party, founded in 1854, an anti-slavery party, but not necessarily an anti-racist party. The Republicans wanting to keep slavery out of the territory so that white farmers would have a fair chance of making a living there. I give Lewis Hayden here. Lewis Hayden was a fugitive from Kentucky. He and his wife Harriet settled in Boston. And he was a loyal Republican, like almost all black voters during this period. And I will say, to vote, you needed only to declare some property. These folks did not own their own homes, but they did own some furniture. So they would claim personal property, pay the $1.50 poll tax each year, and that made them eligible to vote. Lewis Hayden is the exception that proves the rule. In 1858, his clothing shop failed, and he got a job as the messenger for the Massachusetts Secretary of State, a job he kept for his whole life. But he was the only one, really, who could count on that kind of stable job, even though he was a loyal Republican, and the Republicans made use of the spoils system, as the Democrats did as well. Let me go on to a third group, and that is white labor reformers. And before I get to the women, I just wanted to say that Massachusetts had several really well-known labor activists during this period. Iris Stewart was a national figure in terms of promoting the 8-hour day. Frank Keyes Foster was a Massachusetts native and a leader of the Knights of Labor, and along with Samuel Gompers, helped to form the American Federation of Labor in 1886. These white activists proved much more interested in industrial workers, factory workers, than black workers who did this kind of menial, casual labor. And I will just say, of all those mills in Boston's hinterland, Lowell, Lawrence, Lynn, down in Rhode Island, they were eclectic in their hiring of white people. Mill owners hired white men and women, white adults and children, white natives and immigrants, but they did not hire people of color. So we have here these white labor activists. They actually pushed for the first State Bureau of Labor Statistics, and in many ways were considered very progressive and very enlightened. But again, their focus was primarily on skilled workers and also factory workers. So I list Jenny Collins here because she became well known as an advocate for white women workers during this period. And she wrote a book called Nature's Aristocracy, A Plea for the Oppressed in 1871. And it was a condemnation of domestic service as a kind of labor. She said, these poor young women who have to labor day in and out for imperious, penny-pinching employers, these white women who berated them, demeaned them, worked to the bone. She said, nothing is worse as a kind of labor than domestic service. And she said, factory work is much to be preferred. You get a wage, you have set hours, you're not under the thumb of this kind of woman, and so forth. And she was joined in her condemnation of domestic labor by Louisa May Alcott of Little Women fame. Louisa May Alcott wrote a book in 1873 called Work, A Story of Experience, where she too said, you know, what could be worse than laboring as a domestic servant? Well, we need to put that view in perspective, because the idea was white women, if they had a chance, whether they were immigrant or native born, were going to move out of domestic service into the factories, maybe into department stores, working as clerks, anything, so they did not have to work as domestic servants, and instead their places would be filled by women of color. In 1866 to 1867, several hundred refugees from Virginia came to Boston, men, women, and children. The idea was that the women and girls would serve as domestic servants. So this, in a period when the most enlightened labor leaders are saying, what a horrible kind of job this is. But we're going to let Black women and girls take this kind of job. I don't know whether you can see here, but Eliza Meeks, sort of in the middle of this list of migrants, is listed there. She's 43 years old, and she's listed with 8 of her children who came. And then the next, where she came from Hampton, Virginia, and the next columns tell where she and some of the kids were working. So again, a great influx here into Boston, and it was assumed that these women would serve as domestics. Now I want to give you, it's only fair I give you an exception here, and that is the Boston Typographical Union, which in 1864 began publishing their own paper, which was called the Daily Evening Voice. This was the year when they were locked out of their work because they had gone on strike. The Daily Evening Voice advocated the rights of labor without distinction of sex, complexion, or birthplace. The Voice and its successor, a weekly, became the official organ of the Boston Trades Assembly. And departing from white working class orthodoxy, the paper supported admitting Black workers into labor unions in the North. And this is an exceptional quote. And today we're struck by how right, how right this paper was. But I put it here, and I'm telling you about it because the paper folded the next year, and no unions in Boston really took up this cry to integrate their ranks at all. The Voice made the point that all laboring classes were intertwined, the fates of all laboring classes, and that justice for one group meant justice for all. And they pointed to a recent case where white railroad workers went on strike and they were replaced by Black workers who were happy to have the jobs. And the Daily Evening Voice said, you know, that will happen if we don't watch it. And a lot of employers were saying to their workers, don't strike or we'll replace you with all these free people who have just been liberated in the South after the Civil War. So the Voice said, he that might have become our cooperator becomes our enemy if we refused to admit him into our union. So I give that as, an enlightened voice here in 66, one that was not representative of the time, but just to give you an idea that some folks were thinking along these lines. And the typographical union remained atypical. So we've gone through abolitionists, white abolitionists, Republicans, labor leaders, and I also wanted to mention city officials who, beginning in the Civil War, had a great deal of power in terms of hiring people for city works projects. And this is a picture of the filling in of the Back Bay, Boston on a very narrow peninsula, and a lot of the city acreage is landfill, including that beautiful Comm Ave there in Boston. And this is how the Back Bay lands were created. And at the very top, you can see a train coming in. It's coming from Needham, Massachusetts, with gravel that the city workers will then dump out of their carts and make this landfill. The other people here are scavengers. They're called pickers. They're looking through the landfill to see if there are any cast-off things that they can use or sell. Now, we might expect city officials to hire black men in these public works projects, and they did not. They did not, and I said we might expect them to because these black men many of them were taxpayers and would seem to be deserving of these jobs, which went mainly to white immigrants during this period. Another group we might have expected to show some empathy here, white Union veterans of the Civil War. About 180,000 black men served as sailors and soldiers on behalf of the Union cause during the Civil War. And they served with great distinction. This is a picture of John V. DeGrasse, a Boston surgeon who worked for the 55th Massachusetts, which along with the 54th Massachusetts were the two all-black regiments sponsored by the Commonwealth. Black soldiers received only $7 a month in pay. Their white counterparts got $13 a month in pay. Many of the soldiers in the 55th came from out of state. They came from Ohio and Indiana. And so their families did not get the aid that Native black families got because they were from out of state. So Massachusetts gave small stipends to the families of its soldiers, but only if those soldiers were from Massachusetts, which was unfair because the 55th, made up of out-of-state folks, helped Massachusetts meet its quota of Union soldiers, but their families did not get the aid that Massachusetts families got. And then after the war, the veterans segregated their associations and did not really recognize the sacrifices of black men in the war at all. And a final group that I talk about, and that's not a very good picture, but it's social settlement workers and academics in the late 19th century. These are university professors, they're heads of social settlements in Boston. John Daniels was an economist. He wrote this book in 1914 based on data from 1900 about black folks in Boston. In Freedom's Birthplace, it's titled. And he noted that there were no black machine operatives and there were no black department store clerks. And, he asked employers about this and they said, well, we've never had any and we assume they couldn't do the job or they, would be working. Well, there was, a kind of circular and counterintuitive logic in that statement because these employers had always hired whites and had never ventured to hire Black people at all. But what these social settlement workers do, and academics, is they embrace a kind of pseudo-science of racism and say Black people aren't in these jobs because they're incapable of doing them. So what I've done here is provided a look at 6 potential groups of white allies who did not show concern for justice in the workplace. And I'm going to go on now and look at some of the themes that a focus on labor provides us. And this is kind of a scattershot listing of themes, but I want to just impress upon you how rich this topic is. And you know from your own work how rich this topic of labor is. So freedom seekers from the South, these fugitives, created what was called a fugitive economy because many of them had to bribe the crews on ships in order to secure passage to Boston. And here is Elizabeth Blakely, who escaped from North Carolina, endured a 4-week journey aboard ship. She's going to have to start that journey with a certain amount of money. Once these folks got to Boston, in some cases they were aided by the Boston Vigilance Committee. And this was a way for some Black members of the community to make some extra money. If you'll see here, Samuel May Jr. is listed there, but so too is Lewis Hayden. For Daniel Haywood's wife and 3 children, Lewis Hayden was paid $5. We don't know whether that was for medical care for this family, whether it was for tickets to Canada, whether it was for lodging. Lewis Hayden and his wife Harriet at one point had 13 fugitives in their home. And you can guess who was doing all the laundry and the cooking for those fugitives. But in any case, this is part of what I call the fugitive economy, where money changes hands because these fugitives are coming north. Many of them have to find a job right away, and some of them did go to work in the clothing store run by Lewis and Harriet Hayden. But it's really interesting to read because these white abolitionists expect Black people to hit the ground running when they get to Boston to find a job to start making money. And some of these freedom seekers are traumatized by the escape, the terror, the danger involved in escaping from slavery and making their way north. But still, people like Samuel May Jr. were saying, well, you know, these folks have to make a living. They have to take care of themselves. They have to be self-sufficient when they get here. And again, I bring us back to Frederick Douglass because much has been made about Frederick Douglass' quarrel with William Lloyd Garrison over the meaning of the Constitution and whether people should join political parties or whether they were too corrupt to join parties. And we see a new dimension of Frederick Douglass where he's focusing on labor and, again, the hypocrisy of these white abolitionists. I wanted to make a point, too, about the hardship endured by Black anti-slavery activists. Charles Lennox Remond, this is his sister, Sarah Parker Remond, both well-known speakers on the abolitionist trail. And when I started this project, I thought that they made money by, taking a cut of the collection that they took up every night at the end of the meeting. But in fact, they were sponsored by an anti-slavery society that was supposed to pay them a stipend and often did not. And Charles had a family at home that suffered greatly when he was on the road because, again, he was really not getting paid much at all for his work. So many people focus on the eloquence of these speakers, the power, they speak from experience, they speak truth to power, but not many people focus on them as workers and how difficult it was for them to make a living while they were on the road. Also, a really interesting theme, I think, is the performative nature of work on the streets of Boston. So again, think of people looking for work. I give a couple of examples of Black people washing windows, standing on chairs to wash these windows on the sidewalk, and then having the chairs kicked out from them by whites. The streets were a place of labor. There is a carriage driver, an organ grinder, there's a police officer here, but we don't see the casual laborers making their rounds looking for work. Well, there is a counterpoint to all this discrimination, and I do a great deal with the creativity and resourcefulness of men and women who made their own jobs. And one of them was Cyrus Foster. He was called the Deacon, and every year for many years, it must have been at least 20 years, he would sponsor a lecture combined with a concert. And the day before, he would go through the streets of Boston advertising this. It was a well-known fixture in Boston, the Boston cultural landscape. And he would give a talk, and whites would attend. They thought it was quite funny. He spoke with an accent to make people laugh. But essentially the joke was on his audience because he made a great deal of money from these lectures. He always had musical entertainment as well. He's a really interesting character. Another interesting kind of worker I discovered was the rat catcher. So a Boston police officer was going through the streets one night, and he saw a Black man with a sack over his shoulder, and he said to the man, "Put that down on the sidewalk. What do you have in there?" When he put the sack down on the sidewalk, it started to wriggle around. It was full of rats that the rat catcher had picked up in local stables and then sold to the men who ran the rat pit. And the rat pit was, where men would go and bet and see how long it would take a dog to kill 100 rats, or how many rats a dog could kill in 5 minutes, or whatever. But there was a great demand for rats. And this particular man had made $5 that night with his rats, which was quite a haul. Another great personality here is Joseph Clash, who was the owner of a dance hall. The Underground Commons in Boston was a multi-racial workspace. Here Clash puts an ad in the paper. Clash himself was a caterer, a musician, a scam artist, a pimp. He was a very violent man, but his dance hall was really popular, and Black and white men would come and dance with Black women and white women. Prostitutes hung out there, sex workers. And my fullest description of the dance hall comes from two men who attended one night. One was a reporter for the local paper who raved about the food and the music and how great it was, and the other was a local police officer who came to enjoy the spectacle himself. And in fact, whenever Clash would be picked up by the authorities and tried, he was implicated in some murder cases. He was always acquitted because I think the jurors probably attended the dance hall and appreciated the services he offered there. But I also look at, people who make their living in different kinds of ways. So pickpockets, and this is a great term, right? Pickpockettresses that I got from a police officer during this period. I look at ways people make a living. And, file this under ways to make a living as well as crime, right? And my most fascinating discovery, I think, in a way, was the fugitive imposter. And here's somebody writing to William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, the magazine, saying, "Beware of John Johnson, who presents himself to be a fugitive from a wealthy family." Now, these fugitive imposters would go around New England, and they would say, they would have a dramatic escape story. They were really good at crafting a narrative. I escaped. It was, the bloodhounds were after me. The slave patrol was after me. I made it here to Boston. My family is still in the South. Can you help me buy them out of slavery? And they would take up a collection. And then they would hasten off to the next town before someone discovered that they were not, in fact, a fugitive from slavery. They were a free person of color. But again, a kind of job that requires a certain amount of daring, creativity, risk-taking, so forth. I also wanted to mention those relatively well-to-do Black workers in Boston during this period. And I'll just give you a few of them. J.B. Smith was a caterer who had Black and white clients. Robert Morris defended Black and white defendants. Louise de Morty spoke to mixed audiences. An elocutionist was someone who would recite poetry from memory. Christiana Carteau Bannister called herself a hair doctoress. These, and John Bailey owned a gymnasium. The key here, the theme of these workers is that they had a white clientele, and that managed to provide them with a certain stability of income. I'd like to just mention household strategies. A lot of women took in boarders. Fraternal orders, such as the Freemasons and mutual societies, helped people with medical expenses, burial expenses, church groups. And the church groups were dominated primarily by women. And this is Frederick Douglass's wife, Anna, who never learned to read and write, but kept their household going while her husband, famous husband, was off making speeches all over the country and in England as well. But we can't forget that unwaged work. Remember Harriet Hayden's work as well. I also look at the military as a laboring space. So if we look at soldiers, Black soldiers, we're struck by the way the discrimination against them in the military reflected discrimination against them in the civilian workforce. They were paid less than their white counterparts. Black soldiers could not aspire to be officers until very late in the war. They were relegated to what was called fatigue work, in many cases setting up tents, digging trenches for white soldiers during this period. And these unequal assignments, again, reflective of workers in the civilian workforce. So you can see what it takes to put up one of these camps in the South. The trees need to be cut down, the berms need to be built, the tents need to be erected, and often that was Black men's labor. And here are Black refugees put to work by Union officers at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, and it's kind of evocative of a scene of enslaved people there with the white man on the horse directing these workers who are going into the fields there. Really interesting topic is what I call the Boston diaspora, and this is Black workers who went south to see what they could do. And I talk about Harriet Jacobs. She's a very famous fugitive. She came from Edenton, North Carolina, hid in her grandmother's attic off and on for 7 years before she was able to make her way north. And then she was able to bring her 2 sons and her daughter, Louisa, north as well. When they came north, Harriet and Louisa, the only work they could find was as domestic servants. And they both hated that kind of work. They volunteered to go south. They established a school for freed children in Alexandria, Virginia, and then in 1866 they went to Savannah, Georgia, and started a school for Black children there. But again, in a way, kind of pushed out of Boston because of the very few opportunities they had. Harriet Jacobs, the author of a very well-known memoir called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She was quite well read and again could find no jobs commensurate with her talents in Boston. I also just want to reiterate the failure of the Republican Party here in the post-war period. George L. Ruffin, born in Virginia, and became he was the first black graduate of Harvard Law School, became a judge, one of the first black judges in Boston, a loyal Republican who worked for a time for the post office and the customs house, but could never get a promotion in those jobs. He was so thoroughly disgusted. And this is why, even in the late 19th century, some black men broke with the party of Lincoln because Republicans showed very little interest in justice in the workplace for blacks. And another topic here is class. And I found that income was not necessarily related to prestige or social standing in the community. So Leonard A. Grimes was pastor of the 12th Baptist Church in Boston, Octavia. His wife, head of the Sunday school, very active in Women's Missionary Society. They were very well known in Boston among whites and blacks. His church, called the Fugitive Church, was one of the largest black churches in the city, but he and his wife were not that well off because they relied on their congregants, and the congregants were very poor. So every year, the city would take up a charity offering for the Grimeses again. So very well known, very influential, but not really very well off. So I just want to wrap up here with a couple of things. One is we go to 1900, and this is from the John Daniels study about black people in 1900. As I said, the social division of labor in 1900 was essentially the same as it was in 1840. And you'll see here that most black men are working as servants, waiters, janitors. We don't see any bookkeepers on this list. We don't see any teachers. We don't see any clerks, department store clerks, because those jobs were still off limits to black men and women during this period. So let me, on a high note though, I think it's a high note, leave you with the thoughts of Charles L. Woodworth, who was a white minister and a Civil War chaplain for the Union Army. And he's talking here about the freed slave. Woodworth went beyond political civil rights, the right to vote. He focused on the institution of bondage as a critical economic foundation of the nation. Of the Southern freedmen, he declared, "The gains which we have made out of his unpaid labor demand on our part an equal restitution. More than any other man, he has produced the raw material out of which the wealth of the country has been created. Yet for over 200 years, this worker had not received any share of his rightful earnings." And essentially, Woodworth was saying, by working and not receiving any wage for generations, enslaved people gave white people a credit. He says, white people we're in their debt. We owe them. Now that the war is over, we owe them for all that unpaid labor they provided for us and that made New England villages so prosperous and made the country prosperous with the growth of cotton. Woodworth was blunt. He said, "Capital has made sure returns. Disguise it as we may, we have grown rich by robbing the poor and mighty by taking the energies of the weak." Added to this great injustice was the shameful treatment accorded black soldiers, especially because their courage helped to win a Union victory. Woodworth asked, shall we forget how in the day of our calamity, 200,000 strong enlisted and filled up our thinned ranks. Thousands died with a rare and magnificent heroism. Now it would be unseemly for the North to congratulate itself for Army men of color. Neither party in the war meant any good to him. And there is Woodworth saying both political parties have let him down. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that the Civil War was a traumatic event, but it did not affect the social division of labor in Boston. The separate low-wage division of labor was not a natural historical process, but the product of decisions among many groups of ordinary white men and women in concert with employers, clergy, and political leaders. In spite of barriers to economic justice, Black men and women showed resilience and resourcefulness in creating their own jobs and pooling their own resources as members of extended kin groups, churches, mutual aid societies, and fraternal orders. And I think we should remember and honor the struggles of these men and women, not only as freedom fighters, but as workers as well. Thank you.
So you'll take some questions for a little while?
Yeah.
And I just want to say to the Harvard Trade Union Program class, they're going to go to the mills up in Lawrence Law tomorrow. And one of the things that Robert Florent, who will talk to you, historian who will talk to you a great deal tomorrow, he said that, you know, in the past, we told the stories of the mills without the story of the cotton house supplying the place. And he says that's something that's really changed in recent years, that element of labor that was cited in that last quotation is much more a part of the discussion. So you'll be hearing about that a bit tomorrow. And I really appreciate all the things that you showed in this. I have to say there's a growth in books now on soldiers as workers. Mm-hmm. And it was good that you had done that, because so many times when we hear the history of the military, it's all about great battles and strategy, but we have a new social history that's taking up the labor aspects of the military. So, you know, I'm glad that you touched on that. And one thing I did want to ask you, and then we'll let the audience, you have your opportunity. We have a literature that's been growing about the history of other people of color. Like, for instance, we know so much more now about how Chinese workers built the railways. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, you know, we hear a lot about how so much exclusion was done towards them. They couldn't get, you know, we of course had the Exclusion Acts where Chinese were prevented from coming here. But they seemed like they had to get so much work in restaurants and the laundry business. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on the comparative dimension, because I feel like there's probably some similarities there with the levels of discrimination that were faced, and you know, a little compare and contrast on that, I think could be interesting.
Well, certainly most of the unions during this period are trades unions. They're unions of skilled workers. And that, and so by definition, there aren't a lot of Asian immigrants or Black people who seem to be qualified for those jobs, because the apprenticeships are really limited to kin of the members of the union. But, you know, there are exceptions. Again, you can look at the history of the Knights of Labor, which was founded in the 1860s and presumably was going to organize all kinds of workers. And there were integrated units. Richmond, Virginia had some integrated units because these workers realized that, you know, they really should encompass all kinds of people to forestall these threats from employers of bringing in strike breakers. But I looked at radicals in Chicago in the late 19th century, especially those who were rebuilding the city after the Great Fire there. And these were men and women who called themselves really radical. I'm talking about socialists and anarchists. And even they were very insistent that these unions be reserved for white men only, and no white women either, but white men only. I mean, there was the idea that this was a kind of badge of honor to be a member of a union. It was a masculine thing to do. Women should be involved. No immigrants of color should be involved. So it's a really mixed story. It's very roiling, but you go way up into the mid 20th century, and there's still a lot of unions that were overtly discriminatory through a variety of means against people of color. But the Chinese are a good example. Not many Chinese on the East Coast in the period I'm talking about, but certainly in California, there was this argument, they're going to take the jobs of white people, when in fact, that wasn't the case. After the railroads were built, as you say, they mostly went into laundry and restaurant work.
So, do people have questions?
I just want to say, Jack, too, I wanted to add to what you said earlier about thinking where the cotton came from that fueled all these mills, because Boston, as I said, was a very conservative city, and there were a lot of white men who really hated the abolitionists because they seemed to be stirring up a lot of trouble and maybe even endangering the Union. And these white men said, who would kill this golden egg? All this cotton, slave-grown cotton comes north, and we process it in the mills, and then we send it back, and we send it overseas in the form of cloth. And this made some of these men fabulously wealthy, and they couldn't understand why white Southerners would interfere with this. And a lot of their wrath was pointed toward abolitionists. They said, if you didn't, make such a fuss over slavery, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in 1861 with the southern states seceding. So just to give you an idea of how very conservative most of Boston was during this period.
One thing I'll mention, we have several Canadians in the class, and Canada now has a memorial to the 4,000 Chinese workers who built the railroad in Canada, who perished in doing that. It was incredibly dangerous work, both in California, where the Chinese did that work, and in Canada. But it's something, impressive thing that Canada decided to put something up to let people know about it. And so that's a change. But do people have questions for Professor Jones?
Yes?
So in doing your research on the Black Americans, the formerly enslaved, how long did it take you to get that in? Where did you find your information? Was that hard in gathering all of that information?
So historians have been the beneficiaries of a revolution in historical research because of all the material that's online. So for instance, for this project, I used a variety of Boston newspapers that are online, and all you do is put in a term, and out come all the stories about Leonard Grimes and all the stories about Octavia Grimes. It's truly amazing. The Boston City Council minutes are online. They're handwritten, 700 pages for each year, and they're not searchable, but you have to read them all. But that's an incredible body of material. And I tell people, if I had to be on a deserted island, stranded on a deserted island with only one website, it would be Ancestry.com, because there's a tremendous amount of demographic information, census information, birth, death, marriage information on that site that really opens up whole communities that are not leaving much in the way of diaries or letters, that kind of thing. And a lot of this research actually was done during COVID. So I was incredibly lucky because of what I could find online. But there's just such a wealth of material out there. It's truly amazing. So.
Boston. One wonders had the city treated immigrants or previously enslaved people better, at least as good as the Irish, which actually wasn't that great then, but had they progressed, it would have a very different city today.
Yes, I think you're right. And I do make these comparisons because the Irish came desperately poor, fleeing the famine in their homeland, and there was a lot of prejudice against the Irish as well. But what happened was they came in such numbers, they soon became a key constituency of the Democratic Party. And they eventually, through the late 19th century, rose. Some became school teachers, police officers, firefighters, because of that connection to the Democratic Party. City officials gave them work because, again, they were a prized political constituency. So a lot has to do with the numbers. I mean, Black people were not that numerous to make them a valued constituency of any politician. But it's an interesting comparison you raise. And, you know, racial segregation truly took hold very early in Boston. It was one of the most segregated cities. And that really, you know, bears bitter fruit in the 20th century. We look at the busing riots of 1974, you know, the deep divisions between these communities that have been segregated and over the generations. So, yeah, it's an interesting question to ask what might have happened if, you know, all workers, so, you know, were treated with dignity, had an opportunity to advance up the ladder. I mean, one of the issues here is that Black people's jobs do not give them any opportunities for promotions. I mean, if you're going around the streets every day to wash windows or to scrub floors, you know, that's your lot in life, no matter how old you are. And the same with the women, right? I found descriptions of very elderly women still doing laundry, and that was so labor intensive, you know, to carry bundles of laundry through the streets and then wash that laundry in a tub in their tiny apartment, which was, you know, steaming hot. It was a terrible way to make a living, but these women continued to do it into their advanced age. So that lack of opportunity, and, you know, for the Irish, I think there was this possibility that maybe life would be better for their kids, because there was a certain intergenerational mobility where the first generation had it really hard, the second generation too, but by the third and fourth, you know, when you're beginning to see more Irish school teachers and police officers and bookkeepers and department store clerks, you know, then things begin to get better. And the Irish, of course, very active in Boston politics, beginning with the mayor in 1886, James Curley, going on into the 20th century, you know, a great deal of political influence there as well. Black people, not so much because their numbers are so small. So
anything else? I know we have a reception afterwards, and Professor Jones has kindly been willing to sign books. I know so many of you have the book, and you know, we're really grateful to you. Anyone else with a last question?
thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.